One of the great phrases from the 17th century is good wives and nasty wenches, and that's pretty much what we had in Virginia. We had all kinds. The women who arrived in 1619 are the brides. They came on the bride ships. Of the women who come in the 17th century, we really don't hear much about their participation in the church. We hear about their baptisms of their babies very quickly after birth, particularly if the baby is ill. We hear about the really famous babies like Virginia Layton, who was the first baby born in Jamestown. Her mother was Anne Burris, and her father was John Layton. He was a carpenter, and she had been a maid to Mistress Forrest. According to John Smith, they are the first marriage in America and the first marriage at the Jamestown Church, and therefore the first baptism in America. So her name was Virginia Layton. Church records are wonderful because they tell us all these little details. In the 17th century, there were lots and lots of women who show up in the church records sometimes because they've done something wrong, and sometimes because they've done something right. The wrong ones are very funny. I'm probably going to get in trouble for this. Women caught in adultery had to wear sheets to church so that everybody knew they'd been caught. And then public punishment, public knowledge was what kept them in place, I guess. One woman at Jamestown got fussed at because she wore a hat that was above her station. You're not supposed to wear silk if you're not of the right class. And it seems to me she wore a black beaver hat. She wasn't supposed to do that because she wasn't in the upper class. So sometimes women show up in the church records for the oddest reasons. When you get to the 18th century and you move the capital into Williamsburg, women start to show up in the church a little bit more, and the church records are a little bit more complete. Baptism is your entrance into the church. You're sealed with the holy water, and if you have it, the holy oil, and you're sealed. Probably you will be getting married. Almost all the women got married, and almost all the women were constantly having babies, so they're back in the church for baptisms. Some baptisms were held at home, especially if the baby was sick and would be baptized very quickly because of the old ways of thinking about the baby's soul. Marriages, most often, if you're very wealthy, were held at home, and the clergy constantly complained about having to go great distances to conduct marriages and funerals because people in Virginia wanted to be married at home. Frequently the habit is if you get old, you get ill, you go home, you're sick, you die. So it made a perfect thing for those people. They simply were buried at home. But the clergy didn't like it because it meant they had to travel a long way. So they added little fees or big fees for all these services, which is one way they help to make money and pay for their lives. Many homes have a burial ground in town, back at the end of a lot between the necessaries, near the garden, near the orchard. On a little dirt farm, there's going to be a family burial ground. On a big plantation, such as Mount Vernon or Monticello, there are large burial grounds and very carefully tended. Frequently, even here in town, there are little burial grounds with fences around them, and everybody knows, that they're burial grounds. Women are buried by the church, and then there is something which goes on after a woman has given birth, which is called the churching of women, and that goes way back in society. So many days after a woman gives birth, she is purified and able to resume her functions in life, and there's actually a set service for that. Specific psalms are read, specific prayers are said, and the woman is then welcomed back into the community after the ordeal of giving birth. And frequently it's a very thankful service because so many women did not survive childbirth. And so it's often a Thanksgiving time. In the colonial period, it's in the prayer book, but in the colonial period, it's not often referred to, but every so often you'll come across a letter that'll say, let's see, Mrs. Roberts was churched at Fredericksburg. And that's just it. That's just that one line. And so you get the feeling that they did follow the idea of churching women. It's really quite a pretty service. The Psalms and the prayers are very comforting. And after a woman has survived childbirth, comfort is one of the things she certainly does need. In the church, women served. They, perhaps if a woman's husband was very involved in the church and was on the vestry, she might end up making the communion bread because the bread and the wine needed to be supplied. If a woman, I didn't say a lady, if a woman is a widow and she is struggling to survive and she turns to the church for aid, one of the things the church can do is give her a job as sexton or cleaner. That isn't specifically a Bruton Parish excerpt, but that is in other churches in the colony at the time. And normally what happens in one, it's a pretty good guess it's going to be similar in another church. And so there were a number of jobs for women as sextons. Certainly no woman was a clergy person, certainly no woman was a parish clerk, which is kind of like a lay reader, but they were very much in the church. Now, if a woman's father was sufficiently enlightened that she was taught to read, the Bible is a book she used for everything. So if she can read the Bible, she can teach her children from the Bible. If she can read the Bible, she can read the prayer book, which means when she comes to church, she's well equipped to participate in the service, and better, she can teach her children the same thing. A number of people in this area refer in their letters and diaries to their mothers and their grandmothers doing an hour or better of catechism every morning with the children in the family. Catechism is that part in the back of the prayer book where it's all the rules and all the beliefs about your faith and the things we're supposed to know the answers to. And in the English church, as in other churches, teaching the catechism to young children was very important. And so if you were well-born enough and educated enough, a couple of hours of catechism in the morning was quite normal. And at some point, that's passed on generation by generation. And in this area, there were a number of very prominent ladies who kept to that custom their whole lives. And there were women, and not just wives of the governors, a number of them were very devout, but there were women who, I think it's a biblical phrase, going into the closet in the morning every day for prayer and reading the Bible. So once that carries on, that makes for more faith among the women. Women had a tough time in life, not just with childbirth, but with a lot of things. And I think they probably held on to their faith very dearly. And women have often had great trials, but they've also had enormous faith. So the women in the church, they always know what's going on. The little old ladies always have the story. And that's kind of an amusing piece of it. But women generally know what's going on in the church. And in this church, we've talked about the Catherine Memorial Society, where the ladies, in trying to help young people get over a death, came up with a project to keep them busy and worked on the graveyard. That was an example of women doing things. When they were getting ready to raise money to reorganize and repair the church in the 1800s, women had fairs and bake sales and picnics and raised money. So women are doers. They kind of tend to get it all done. But the faith of the women is certainly nurtured in the church, and certainly throughout years, it's the women who have tended the vestments of the clergy. It's the women who have tended the altar. It's frequently the women that have done the flowers, the women who have kept the worship space. There's a 17th century quote about being passing fair and sweet with flowers. Keep the church fit for God and fit for worship. and women are always the ones who have done that. Now that changes as society changes. You know, men can do flowers now, and women can be ushers now. You know, women can be on the vestry, and men can teach Sunday school. For years and years and years, only women taught Sunday school. So the roles are kind of moving around a little bit, but in the colonial period, they were pretty clear. Women were the doers. And it was the church who provided for poor widows and orphans and other parishioners who were unable to get a living due to illness, injury, or old age. A woman might actually get a job, a paying job at the church. She could be the sexton, which means she would come and keep the church clean, and she would make sure that it was kept ready for services and that it was always respectable. And there are all sorts of references to keeping the church always clean, always pure, always holy. From the tabernacle days, all of this is to be pristine at all times. And so a woman sexton would frequently get a paying job. In the colonial period, women don't vote. Women who head their own households, such as widows and never married women, must pay taxes to support the church based on the number of tithables or taxable people in their households. So if a widow has a son and 2 slaves, all 16 years or older, she's got 3 tithables. Free women were not tithables. The parish vestry adds up their expenses for the year, support for the poor, repair or construction of church, minister's salaries set by law, and divides by the number of tithables in the parish to find the amount due the parish for each tithable. Hannah Lee Corbin, sister of Richard Henry Lee, wrote to him that as a widow she was responsible for paying taxes to the colony, the county, and the church every year, but that even though she was a freeholder who owned land which qualified a man to vote, Virginia law did not allow women to vote, so she had no say in what taxes she paid. Much to my delight, I found that there were women in New Jersey at that point who not only had a say, they voted for a very brief period of time. So a lot of what we're talking about is specific to Virginia. Women are frequently the background of everything and the backbone of everything that goes on, whether it's in the home or whether it's in a club or whether it's in the church or the synagogue or any part of society. Women are always the ones who get it done. There's an old phrase, the hand that rocked the cradle rules the world. So mothers and other women generally get a lot of stuff done. And in the colonial picture, all women were parishioners, just as all men were parishioners. Women come in many flavors and many shades and many perspectives because they are different pieces of the puzzle. A gentlewoman who has a wonderful, famous name and very blue blood is going to have the same benefits from the church that a very poor person who's female, who is struggling from one day to the next. The church can take care of both of them, sometimes in the same way and sometimes in different ways. Women, like everybody else, were baptized, sometimes as infants, sometimes as young children, sometimes as adults. Women are married by the church, not necessarily in the church, but they are married by the church. Sick women were very often cared for by the church. For instance, I'm a lot older than you are, so let's say I get really sick with something and there's no one to take care of me. You have enough room in your home so that you could find a place for me to sleep. I would come and stay at your house. You would take care of me, make sure I had everything I needed, and the church would reimburse you every year for whatever I needed. And if I get well, good. If I don't, you make sure I get a decent burial and then the church reimburses you for that. So social work was kept within the church, and that's a place where women had an enormous responsibility, because the women are always the caregivers, women are almost always the nurses, women are almost always the ones who are quietly in the background. You know, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. So it's the women in the background that are quietly doing all this. So think about all the sick, all the babies, all the poor, all the street people. It's the women who keep all that moving and make sure people get help. This church did have at one point a poorhouse. We know where it was. The vestry of Bruton submitted a petition to the General Assembly to build one due to the large number of needy people who filtered into Williamsburg when the General Court met, and then did not leave to return to their home parishes. The General Assembly passed a bill in 1755 permitting parishes to operate poorhouses when needed. We know what people thought of it, because the poor, as our Lord said, the poor will always be with you. The kind side of it is they would have a roof over their heads, they would have food, they would have some clothing, and they would get something done, because the better sort would give them something to do, some work, so they could be useful. Women in the 19th century in the church are a force to be reckoned with. We look at the Battle of Williamsburg in the Civil War, and how this church became a hospital, and how the women of the town came in to tend the wounded, and what happened with the Union in control in a Confederate town. And as the Confederate Army retreated to protect Richmond, the women left here had to deal with Confederate wounded, and a Union in control. And General McClellan said that for anybody to pray or have services in this church, they were to pray for Mr. Lincoln. Well, of course, these folks aren't about to pray for Mr. Lincoln. So the rector of the church took the silver and the Bible and the prayer book and went to his home and had services and gave out communion when necessary. And there was a Union chaplain here. So that was an exceedingly difficult time. But the women of the town were tending all those casualties. They were dealing with all those amputations. They were dealing with the fact that the water was at a minimum, that the food was gone, that the gardens had been used, everything was gone, and it's the women who have to make it all work. A few years after that, it is a couple of women who put together the beginnings of what we call the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, which is now called Preservation of Virginia, which is the oldest historical preservation society. They started with the powder magazine and ultimately got properties all over the state. And so it's kind of an interesting prelude to women wanting to speak for themselves and wanting to have a say in what goes on, because they realized in the 1700s that they didn't have a clue about ever having a say, you know, in anything. The women in the church are certainly here as worshipers. They are certainly here as beautiful additions to the church. Every so often, you find that one woman, frequently a gentlewoman, is going to be called to do something. And there's a wonderful example at one point when they were getting ready to try to hire a new rector for this church, and they called two women to testify before the vestry about what they had heard this man say. And they had a rumor or good church gossip or bad church grapevine, however you want to say it, that he had said some things that probably weren't appropriate for somebody who was going to be the rector of the church. So they called these women to come to a meeting at the church of the vestry to testify either for or against this man. That is absolutely phenomenal that they would be given that kind of a role. They were very well-born ladies, and they came and reported what they had heard, and it was noted everywhere that these women had been called to this meeting, because it was so unusual to have a woman called that way. The women in the church Some of it is a little bit amusing to me. A decision recorded in the 1716 vestry records, the men sat on the north, the women sat on the left. Now, as you walk around the church and look, there are lots of doors with lots of names. There is one woman with a name that the visitors can see. It's over here, and her name is Martha, and her last name at that point was Custis. Of course, she's Martha Dandridge Custis Washington. It is in deference to the men in her life that her name is on the door. The names weren't added in this order till 1939. She never would have been, she would have been amazed to find her name on a door. There was a point in her life where people called her Lady Washington, because by that point they were trying to make Mr. Washington into a king. And she was just amazed at being Lady Washington. You know, that wasn't in her experience to expect that at all. Women in the church are almost always the backbone of the church, and you see this so much in the 19th century as we move into the Second Great Awakening. Women come into their own as far as being Sunday school teachers, choir mistresses. They are not just cleaning the church and baking the communion bread, they're actually participating. It isn't until 1974 that the Episcopal Church starts to ordain women so that they can actually serve at the table and be a rector and have a real role of leadership. But along the line, women can become Sunday school teachers, and they can become church secretaries, and they can have some participation in the church. The women today are a force to be reckoned with. In fact, some pretty strong women in this place, and lady clergy everywhere.